Off to a great start. We're off to a great start.
Wait a minute.
We're a new show.
How does it go? How does it work?
We've never done this before, so these hiccups are expected. Well, hello, and welcome to Cinema Shock, a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution of cult and genre movies. I am one of your hosts, Gary Horne.
I'm co-host Justin Bishop. We are joined this week by our good friend, Mr. Todd A. Davis, writer, comedian, and zombie expert, I'm assuming, which is why he's here.
Yeah, I love it. I'm all about it. Thanks for having me back.
Well, thank you for coming back. This is the first episode. What are you talking
that's
about?
Right.
Yeah, this is episode number 1.
Episode 1.
That's right. Thanks for having me. I'll put my hand. Okay, edit. Okay. I'm the first edit. Yay!
No, Gary already screwed up before he even did his intro, so
I'm leaving it all in. So whatever.
Well, welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of Cinema Shock. So just to give you a quick introduction for what we're going to do on this show, basically each and every week we're going to take a deep dive into the creation of some of our favorite cult movies, and then we're going to offer our thoughts on the film. Pretty simple. We're not breaking any new ground here, but we do hope that we do it in a way that is maybe more entertaining than you've heard before. I don't know. Maybe it's not. Who knows? But we'll do our best. But as a result, we are going to get into some pretty heavy spoilers on all the movies. So the idea really is that you watch the movies along with us. So we really hope that that'll happen. We will announce every week what movie we're going to talk about the following week. And, so that'll give you a chance to watch it along. I'm sure that you've seen this week's episode or this week's film, because it is incredibly well known, but that may not be the case in the coming weeks. So if you have not seen this week's movie for some reason, I guess hit pause, go watch it, because otherwise we're going to spoil the shit out of it. So this is your spoiler warning. And what we decided to do, so we're trying to figure out, how do you kick off a brand new movie podcast? What movie do you talk about? And we couldn't think of anything more fitting than to cover a film that literally kickstarted an entire genre, or at least an entire subgenre of film. So that we're going to spend the next few weeks celebrating the work of the late, great king of the zombies, Mr. George A. Romero. And we're beginning with the film that started it all, Night of the Living Dead.
Welcome to a night of total terror. Night of the living dead, the dead who live on living flesh, the dead whose haunted souls hunt the living whose bodies are the only food for these ungodly creatures. Night of the living dead. A bizarre adventure in fear. An experience in shock, more shattering than your strangest nightmare. Night of the living dead. A night with the dead who cannot die. A night of total terror. Night of the Living Dead.
If you haven't seen Night of the Living Dead, I don't.
Fuck you.
I was wondering what percentage of the audience that would listen to this show has not seen Night of the Living Dead. I mean, it's pretty.
It's iconic, but hey, you never know what blind
That's
spots
true. That's
You know what we could do? I was thinking about this earlier, and maybe by the time you're hearing this, you'll have seen it happen. But we could literally just upload the movie to our
legally.
YouTube channel.
We are. This is the one movie we're going to do on this podcast that we are legally allowed to upload onto our YouTube channel if we want to. So who knows? What the hell? We'll Put it up there. Put our logo in the corner.
Right, there you go.
Yeah,
that's marketing, baby.
That's right. There you go, Gary, our marketing genius over here. So before we continue, I do want to acknowledge what my main source of information for this book was, because this was a wealth of knowledge. There are no shortage of sources for information on behind the scenes stories about Night of the Living Dead. You can go on Amazon Prime right now and watch a movie called Birth of the Living Dead, I believe is what it's called. It's a whole documentary about it. And so a lot of this is not necessarily new information that you're going to find, but this book that I read actually had a lot of stuff that I had never heard before about the Night of the Living Dead, about the making of the Night of the Living Dead. And it is called appropriately Night of the Living Dead, Behind the Scenes of the Most Terrifying Zombie Movie Ever Made. It's written by Joe Kane. Very easy to find. I grabbed a copy on Kindle for $10. So if you're interested in George Romero and his zombie movies, especially this particular one, I highly recommend it.
Weird. I thought we would be like the first people to discuss this film. And
yeah, you think so?
Yeah.
52 years later, nobody's ever talked about it.
Oh, that is disappointing to find out someone else has discussed it at some point.
So when you think about George Romero, what's the first thing you think of? You think of zombies or those cool glasses of his,
or his beard. I often think about George Romero. So there's many things over time you evolve in features that you. And I don't mean cinematic. I mean his bodily features.
What are the
focus in on?
What are the triggers that get you thinking about George Romero, Gary? What is it?
Yeah, usually my wife when she first wakes up in the morning.
Okay, all right.
I've already kicked out of the show for that. She just canceled it, so
she's done. We just lost a listener. Well, George Romero, he crafted a lot of other classic horror movies, and over the next several weeks, we're going to be discussing quite a few of those. But it's his relationship with the zombie subgenre that truly cemented his legacy. But the concept of the living dead didn't just spring from Romero's imagination in 1960s Pittsburgh. Like the living dead, the concept of the living dead has been with us for nearly as long as recorded history. And if you're talking about pop culture specifically, you've got vampires, you've got Frankenstein's monster, you've got mummies. Like these are all technically part of the living dead category.
Lazarus and Keith Richards also.
Lazarus, Keith Richards is he's still shambling around. Lazarus is true. Is that the first recorded zombie story?
I mean, it feels like it.
I was just thinking about that. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, many of these monsters have been around for centuries. I mean, vampires or the variations of vampires have been around for since well before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. And even, Frankenstein's monster, that's a more recent one, but even that was written in 1818. And it would be over a century before there were any mentions of zombies in literature. The earliest mentions of the zombie came in a book by a sensationalist travel writer by the name of William Seabrook, a book called The Magic Island. Published in 1929, The Magic Island, it told the stories of deceased Haitians who were often the victims of voodoo vengeance. They were taken from their graves and then forced to act as slaves for those who'd reanimated them. And now this story of the Haitian zombies has a lot of historic. There's a lot of historical stuff that kind of feeds into that based on the French's, takeover of Haiti and things like that. There's a lot of background from where that kind of sprang from. But this book, The Magic Island, was the first one to really bring it to a lot of Western audiences. Here's a little quote from that book, if you will, Gary.
The zombie, they say, is a soulless human corpse, still dead, but taken from the grave and endowed by sorcery with a mechanical semblance of life.
I'm absolutely transported.
Wow, I'm hard.
That's it. I used to tap William Seabrook's phone calls, and so that's what he sounded like.
That's exactly it's historically accurate.
Right.
But this book by William Seabrook was wildly influential and very, very popular. And naturally, of course, that means it caught the attention of Hollywood, who at the time in Hollywood, Universal was the reigning king of horror movies. They had released several popular silent films starring Lon Chaney in the 1920s before bringing Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to the screen in 1931. Of course, we all know these movies. The Mummy came a year later in 1932. And with that trio of movies, of course, Universal introduced the new titans of horror that kind of took the place of Lon Chaney, the early horror star. He had actually already passed away by this time. But those titans were, of course, Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. But it wasn't Universal who created the first zombie movie. It was a couple of brothers named Victor and Edward Halperin. They were a director and a producer, respectively. And they created a movie, a classic movie in 1932 called White Zombie.
I've seen that. Is that another public domain one that we could slap our logo on and post it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. It's but it is readily available. It's very easy to find.
Yeah.
More human than human. You know.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Astro Creek 2000. I was just waiting for that joke.
Yeah, it had to happen. I was gonna back off of it. I'm like, what are we even doing here if we don't like take that low-hanging fruit? We have to.
And although White Zombie was not produced by Universal, but they actually shot it on the cheap using old Universal horror movie sets. And of course, it starred Dracula himself, Bela Lugosi. It follows the rules of Seabrook's book pretty closely. Lugosi plays a zombie master who uses this powder that turns the living catatonic, which is a little bit different from what's going on in Seabrook's book. And then, of course, it keeps corpses resurrected as sort of slaves to work at his sugar mill. White Zombie was really successful, and it led to a lot of follow-ups, including one by the Halperins themselves called Revolt of the Zombies. That was in 1936. It does not hold up as well as White Zombie. And White Zombie itself, if you've ever seen it, it's fine. It's okay. It's serviceable. There's nothing truly special about it.
Yeah.
Actually, now that you mentioned that, Todd, and we got here, I forgot that when I was looking at this earlier, there was like talks about in 2009 about Tobe Hooper remaking White Zombie.
Oh yeah.
Oh man, that'd be cool.
But they ran into like there was a script and everything, and there was something due to rights issues. But they were saying like the movie's public domain. Why is there rights issues? And I can't remember what we'd have to look more into it.
Does Rob Zombie now own the name?
Probably.
I bet
that's what it is.
Oh, that's funny.
I bet there's something there.
Why doesn't he just read it?
And that's yeah. I mean, I was going to say that's actually kind of ironic. And he should just go ahead and pull the trigger. Yeah.
As I'm looking at it here, actually, screenwriter Jared Rivet, who worked on a script in 2007 with Hooper, said the project was halted due to rights issues. Rivet explained that White Zombie is clearly public domain, but there were question marks about uncredited source material.
Interesting.
Maybe we'll have to about White Zombie.
We'll have to dive into that one later, maybe in a new series down the line. So 1936 also saw the release of The Walking Dead, a movie starring Boris Karloff as one of the reanimated, and that's a role he would also play in 1939's The Man They Could Not Hang. So the 30s and 40s saw a slew of Living Dead films. I mean, way too many for me to name here. There are dozens of them. They were very popular at the time, with most of the zombies in these movies behaving essentially like the ones in Seabrook's book. So in the 1950s, zombies sort of took a back seat to giant radioactive monsters, invaders from Mars, things like that, with a few exceptions, one of which was Ed Wood's infamous Plan 9 from Outer Space, which of course saw Tor Johnson and Vampira as the reanimated dead. And they actually, if you've ever seen Plan 9, which you should, it's super fun. They actually,
Ed Wood.
What's that?
I said Ed did see Ed Wood as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. But the way that they played the reanimated dead in that movie really resembles what Romero would end up doing later on, a decade and a half later, more than just about any iteration of the Living Dead that had been put on screen so far. So it's actually kind of an interesting placeholder there in zombie history. In 1962, Roger Corman got on the whole zombie train as well, sort of. I mean, his version of the Living Dead was in an adaptation of one of the many Edgar Allan Poe adaptations that he did. One called Tales of Terror that was it was like an anthology film, where it was, I think, 3 different Edgar Allan Poe stories. And in one of those stories, a reanimated Vincent Price appeared. It was a segment called The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, which is actually a story that George Romero himself would adapt nearly 30 years later in the Dario Argento collaboration, Two Evil Eyes.
It's worth mentioning here, just for a side note, this is kind of a carryover from our last show. So if this is the first time you're listening to us on episode 1, we appreciate you and sorry. But Roger Corman's name comes up all the time. And I told my wife about this just because it kept coming up for us in Psychotronic Film Society. And now that I've told her, there's an alert that goes off in brains every time he's mentioned. And she points him out every single time, and it's a lot. It's a lot, yeah. Even when you don't even expect to see him.
He always is somehow connected to whatever story behind the scenes stories on these genre films that we're looking in. Almost every movie, as far as genre stuff like this, has some sort of connection a couple degrees away from Roger Corman.
I was actually just thinking it'd be fun to play like a degrees of Roger Corman game.
It'd be easy.
We were literally last weekend watching Elvira, and there was a conversation about Roger Corman's name comes up, and she was like, "Oh, I get what she's talking about now."
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just kind of interesting.
So there were 2 other films that seems to really have had the most influence on Romero. One of those was 1961's Carnival of Souls, directed by Herc Harvey. Carnival of Souls features these pretty haunting images of, they're not zombies, but they're zombie-like phantoms that are kind of chasing the heroine in that movie. And it certainly feels like a spiritual ancestor to Night of the Living Dead. And having been created by the operators of a commercial and industrial film house in the fairly small town of Lawrence, Kansas, may have also influenced Romero's business model, as we'll see here in a minute.
Now, didn't Bela Lugosi also pursue his heroine?
Hey, that's why we have you on the show, Todd.
Thank you so much. Performing all over the Southeast.
The other film that influenced Romero was 1964's The Last Man on Earth, which was based on Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend, and that may have been the biggest influence of all, or at least the novel itself was certainly an influence that Romero has stated time and again was a big influence on it. In that movie, that movie features slow-moving human corpses turned predators. You've got boarded up windows, and you see the zombies or whatever they're called in that movie, their hands bursting through the boarded up windows. There's an infected child. There are human bonfires, all kinds of elements that would soon be seen in Romero's film. In fact, the first time Richard Matheson saw Night of the Living Dead, he's watching it and going, did they make another film version of I Am Legend and didn't tell me? Because it was that clearly influenced by it. Obviously, the story is different, but a very heavy influence.
Oddly enough, Romero wanted Will Smith initially for the role of Ben. It was just unavailable.
Yeah,
because he wasn't born yet. He may have been born. I guess Will he was a child. Let's say he was a child, a toddler.
Will Smith's listening right now and is like, God dang, dude, how old do you think I am?
Will Smith was born in 1968.
The year of Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, there you go.
It was fate. That's what that's called.
But that I Am Legend, Romero has even stated that I Am Legend was more of an influence even than Seabrook's book or the films that it sort of influenced, because he didn't consider what he did zombies. He's quoted as saying, zombies to me were those, this is a quote from him, those bug-eyed cats from those movies from the 40s. And because that's how they would often portray them. They would have the actors would actually have sort of prosthetic eyes, these big bulging, unblinking eyes. Sometimes it's very strange. And there's a lot of racial stuff in those original zombie movies that are fairly problematic, including White Zombie itself. I think Bela Lugosi is supposed to be Asian in White Zombie, which is a whole nother issue.
Well, with our refresh here, I won't attempt to do my impersonation of what that might have sounded like.
Thank you, Gary. The year is 2020.
But
appreciate it.
But I, on the other hand, here we go. No, just kidding. Just kidding.
So fast forward a couple years, January 1967, you've got a 26-year-old George Romero. He's meeting with John Russo, Rudy Ricci. These are all principal employees of a small Pittsburgh industrial film and commercial house that they had founded called The Latent Image. They meet over lunch. They're doing okay. The Latent Image is doing steady work, but it's not booming, you know. They were getting a lot of local commercial work and things like that. They did some work on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, a good bit of work on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, actually. But they're kind of bemoaning their business struggles. And it's in this lunch that Russo makes the offhand remark that, hey, we should make a cheap feature-length film for the drive-in circuit. And they went through different genres. They went through, you know, we can't do a Western. We don't know anybody that owns a horse. You know, so we can't really do that. Yeah. And things like that. They went back and forth on a few different genres. And these inexpensive genre films tended to be pretty profitable because, again, they were cheap to make, and it was a pretty steady market in the drive-thrus at the time. So it was a good way for budding filmmakers to make a quick buck, hopefully get a little bit of attention, and be able to finance the next film, the movie they really want to make. You know, that was sort of their thinking.
Well, that sounds kind of like the MO of guys like Robert Rodriguez and Sam Raimi, especially at the start of their careers too.
Yeah, exactly. So luckily the Latent Image had all the equipment that they might need to make a feature-length movie. They had all the cameras, the lighting, all of that, but they still lacked the funds. Now the company, the members of the company were willing to shell out about $6,000. There's about 10 people, $600 a piece they were going to throw in. But even in 1960s Pittsburgh, that was barely enough to even scrape together a 30-second commercial. So they started thinking, like, what kind of movie could we sell and could we make on such a low budget? So Russo suggested, hey, why don't we make a monster movie? So they started thinking of ideas, and the first concept that they had was, let's say, it's a far cry from the film that we would eventually be getting. So here's what Russo would recall about that first concept.
I lost my...
I've got it. The first concept, one that we all liked, was about monsters from outer space. Only it was going to be a horror comedy instead of a horror drama. Some teenagers hot-rodding around the galaxy were going to get involved with teenagers from Earth, befriending them, while cartoon-like authority figures stumbled around trying to unearth clues to the crazy goings-on. The outer space teenagers were going to have a weird, funny pet called the Mess. A live garbage disposal that looked like a clump of spaghetti. You just toss empty pop cans, popsicle sticks, or whatever into the mess, and it ate them. There was also going to be a wacky sheriff called Sheriff Suck, who was totally inept and kept being the butt of all the teenagers' jokes.
Sheriff Suck later showed up in another movie.
I was like, who's going to get to it first?
Sheriff Suck and the Mess are the name of Gary and Todd's morning DJ duo.
You're on Cinema Shock Broadcasting with Sheriff Suck. The Mess.
Oh, there's all this spaghetti.
And you're here for another block of nothing but Nickelback.
Yeah, it's Butt Rock Wednesday. So this concept, as fun as it might sound, it required special effects that the crew really could not afford. They weren't going to be able to shoot a space set, drama. I love that they said it's going to be a horror comedy, not a horror drama. But I love that this was like, oh, what can we make really cheap? Let's set a movie in outer space, like with a living clump of spaghetti. So Russo later came up with a similar concept. We'll go for it again, Todd.
Todd, that's you now.
Oh,
You old
okay. It's
Russo.
me now?
Yeah, you're
Okay.
Russo now.
I'm Russo. Ghoulish people or alien creatures would be feeding off the human corpses, setting them under the planes of glass so that the flesh would rapidly and properly decompose to suit the ghouls' tastes. Whatever we did should start in a cemetery, because people find cemeteries spooky.
I'm gonna if I could just deliver a note here on episode 1 of Cinema Shock podcast. When you're playing the same person, you should use the same voice.
Did I
Just an
not?
idea.
Oh my god.
I feel like that was different. I don't know. Maybe
It was
we'll
slightly
review the tape.
different. It was
A little
slightly
different?
different.
All right.
But that one had a little more. I don't know. The first
had a
one
little
had
more, like-
oomph in it, and
The second one had a little more like late night horror host,
Okay, all right.
but like at on a public access station in Cleveland.
late night horror host. Not a good one, but a late night horror host.
So Russo takes this vague idea to Romero, and Romero likes it. He comes back a few days later with 40 pages of script, and these 40 pages would form the first half of what would eventually be called Night of the Living Dead.
Yay.
And so Romero and then his colleagues from the Latent Image, they formed the Image 10, because there were 10 of them. The group, that's the group that would end up producing the film. That group included Romero, Russo, and Ricci, of course, with other Latent Image cohorts, Russell Schreiner, who worked as a producer, Vince Cervinsky, who was the production manager, the production designer, Gary Striner, who was Russell's brother and also ran the sound on the film. And then they had some friends named Carl Hardman, who actually had his own film company called Hardman Associates. He came on as a co-producer and an actor. And then Marilyn Eastman, who would end up doing not only acting, but makeup as well.
There's a whole world of places I want to go as a wrestling fan to talk to you about the Striner brothers, but I will neglect that.
Big Papa Pump. So the group kind of collectively brainstormed the second half of the story, with scripting duties falling to Russo himself. And of course, directing duties ended up going to Romero. They kind of went back and forth on who would direct, but the way they kind of did things at the Latent Image at the time were, hey, whoever was like the cameraman was the director. That's kind of how they did it. So Romero ended up being the cameraman and the director and the editor. He did all kinds of shit on this movie.
Yeah, I saw where he had almost as many credits as Robert Rodriguez does.
Yeah. Romero grew up as a movie fanatic in the Bronx. He became especially enthralled by horror movies as a kid, with his favorite being Howard Hawks' The Thing from Another World. He actually tells a story where he told his parents he was going to the prom when he was in high school. And he dressed up in a tux, and instead of going to the prom, he went into the city and just watched movies all night. Just watched horror movies all night, which I think is wonderful.
That's awesome.
But he began his filmmaking career very early on at the age of 11 when his uncle gifted him an 8mm camera. Like so many filmmakers you hear about, he started making movies at home as a kid. But even as he continued to make homemade sci-fi films throughout his teens, he didn't ever really see himself pursuing a career in filmmaking. For one, in Pittsburgh at the time, you couldn't really major in film. There was no film program, so he went to college at what is now Carnegie Mellon University. It had a different name. It was a technical college at the time. But he went to college to pursue an art major.
You know, what's funny about him, too, is I was actually watching this, what's the guy's name? Colin Geddes, I think is his name.
Yeah.
He was doing an interview with him at TIFF, and it was a really nice conversation they had. But Romero was telling the story about how when he was younger, basically, you know, obviously pre-VHS, you'd have to rent prints of a movie to show it, and he was always like really into showing movies to his friends and that sort of thing. One of the movies that was his absolute favorite movie, he said at the time, he was like, he tells this long story short, he was going to the movies with his parents or his aunt and uncle or something, and he wanted to go see Tarzan. They made him go see this movie called The Tales of Hoffman by Michael Powell, and he hated them for that. But that has since become his favorite film of all time, I think.
Huh.
And so as he's telling the story, he talks about, like, as he got a little older, he was like renting prints from the library, and as he's renting prints, he would often go and rent The Tales of Hoffman. He loved renting that one over and over and showing it to whoever he could show it to. And he said it was always easy because nobody ever wanted that movie. And he said finally he ran into this problem one day where he went and they were like, sorry, it's out. And he got really annoyed, and he went back the next week, and they're like, yeah, it's out again. Sorry. And like, he kept having this issue, and he was like, man, he finally goes back, and they're like, the movie's out. Sorry. And he's like, every time I come here, this movie's here, and now I can't see this movie anymore. And they're like, yeah, there's this other kid named Scorsese who keeps coming in and renting it every week.
Oh man, that's awesome.
Nice.
I love that. So as a college student, he did still, have that filmmaking bug, and he actually tried to get some movies off the ground. One that he tried, and you got to think, Romero at the time, as much as he loved horror movies, he was kind of an art house movie kid as well, as a love of a Michael Powell movie would indicate, actually. But so this movie that he tried to get off the ground while he was in college was it was called Wine of the Fawn. It was like medieval set film. He described it as being in the vein of Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring, which actually, if you are unaware, was actually the basis of, or the inspiration for Wes Craven's Last House on the Left.
Oh, okay, cool.
But a very much more artsy version of it. But while he was planning this movie, he was interviewing actors, and one actor that he actually interviewed on it was a young guy who was trying to break into the industry that would later become a special effects master by the name of Tom Savini.
Ah, there you go.
I thought that was super interesting. Because Savini was from Pittsburgh as well. So their paths were crossing pretty early on in both of their careers. That movie never got made, of course, and it would be years later before they actually collaborated. But I thought that was really fun, really interesting, something I never knew before.
Nice.
Here's actually what Savini had to say about that.
George came to my high school to audition people. Later, I approached him about doing the makeup for his Night of the Living Dead. He was so busy, I followed him around the studio, flipping pages of my portfolio. He said, yeah, man, we could use you. Unfortunately, they called me to go into the Army right before George shot. So when he did that, I was in Vietnam.
I like that you say Vietnam.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know how Savini says it. I should have researched that prior, but
he says it a lot, so he will often remind you that he was in Vietnam.
It was crazy when I was thinking about the idea that even at the end of this movie, there's like actual photos from the situation. I was like, oh man, he was like a combat photographer. It would have been cool if like Savini had done this, because he would know exactly how to line those shots up and all of that stuff.
It would have been cool. I thought that was really interesting. So, because he had auditioned for this role in The Wine of the Fawn and wasn't able to do it. So, but he still knew Romero, and I mean, he didn't know him before then, but he was like, man, as a director in Pittsburgh was not like a filmmaking community. And he's like, yeah, man, I also do special effects. And that's when he started showing his portfolio for Night of the Living Dead. But their collaboration could have started much, much earlier, if not for, war.
Yeah, that'll ruin your weekend.
Yeah. So the group eventually got 10 additional investors. They brought the budget up to a whopping $12,000. It would eventually get more. I think the total, all in all, when all was said and done, was a little over $100,000, which is still relatively inexpensive, even in 1968 terms, for a feature film.
It's kind of crazy to think about, though, when you look at this. Despite all the things we can say about what this movie really is, I think indie movies owe a big thank you to this movie. Like, it wasn't the first independent movie ever, but like, it seems like an early example of crowdfunding. It's going to be super successful outside of the Hollywood system that sort of thing. It just,
yeah, it's true.
kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, it would end up being a major inspiration for other regional filmmakers, saying like, you don't have to be in Hollywood to make a hit movie. You can be in Pittsburgh, or, you know, Todd mentioned Robert Rodriguez earlier. You can be in Austin, Texas, and do everything you need to do in Austin, Texas, instead of going to Hollywood or going to New York.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so they had their budget, but they still needed a house where the bulk of the film's action would take place. And on such a small budget, they couldn't afford to just like build an entire house set only to destroy it and tear it down by the end of it. Luckily, an intern at the Leighton Image found an old farmhouse that was set to be bulldozed. And it was perfect. It was exactly what they needed. And the owner agreed to rent it to them for $300 a month, just for the few months that they needed it. And then he would bulldoze it when they were done. So
Nice.
with a location secured, the crew dove headfirst into production. Many of the Image 10 members were pulling double or triple duties. So you've got Romero, as I mentioned, he's directing, but he's uncredited, but he is also the film's cinematographer, camera operator, and editor. Carl Hardman, producer from Hardman and Associates. He also worked as a still photographer on the film, and he played the role of Harry Cooper. He's one of the main characters in the film.
Nice.
And you'll see that's a pretty common occurrence on the set of Night of the Living Dead, with acting duties often being given to producers or other Leighton Image cohorts, because it saved them money. Like, hey, we're already paying you to produce, might as well put you on screen. Then that's another actor we don't have to hire and pay.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that seems to be the norm for most indie films, you know, starting off. Everybody's pulling double and triple duty.
Yeah.
Well, and his daughter is the daughter in the movie, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but for the lead role, they needed a legitimate actor, a legitimate leading man, although that wasn't originally the plan. It was originally, so the lead role of Ben was originally written as a rough and tough, like tough talking trucker type guy. And it was envisioned for Rudy Ricci, another Leighton 10 member, or actually a Leighton Image founder. He was going to play that role, but they were still doing auditions. And when a 31-year-old black man by the name of Dwayne Jones auditioned for the role, everyone was sort of blown away. Dwayne Jones was an actor from New York and an acting teacher. And they watched him, and they're like, everyone, including Ricci, were like, this is the guy. This is the guy for the role. Now, Romero was always adamant that he did not write Night of the Living Dead to be any sort of social commentary. He has said multiple times that he didn't cast Dwayne Jones because he was black. He was simply the best actor for the role. And I agree I believe him to an extent, at least. I do think that he probably, once they cast him, he knew he had something special going on. But he did make the conscious decision not to rewrite any of the story just because Jones happened to be black. He wasn't trying to make it a social commentary on race.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, there are obviously there are things that Jones does that are impacted by race.
Absolutely, yes.
But yeah, George talks about, in his stories, it's just like driving to deliver a print and then hearing that Martin Luther King was shot.
That was when he was actually shopping the print around. He was on his way to Columbia Pictures to try to sell the film after it was shot, and he heard about Martin Luther King being assassinated, and he knew that that would impact the way people watched the film.
Right.
Wow.
And Romero even says, this is a direct quote, perhaps Night of the Living Dead is the first film to have a black man playing the lead role regardless of, rather than because of his race. So the role was not written as a black man. That statement's not strictly true. He wasn't the first. Sidney Poitier had done it a couple of times in 1965 and 1966 in a movie called The Bedford Incident and Duel at Diablo. These were movies that were not necessarily written, like the race was not written into the role, but still it was significant. and Jones did decide to rewrite a lot of his own dialogue. Ben, as written, was this sort of stereotypical trucker type, speaking in kind of redneck slang. Like, you can find this book that I quoted earlier has a really good side-by-side of a specific scene from the film. It's from Ben's big monologue as it was originally written and as it was performed. And it's a vastly different, with all the same information, but vastly different in dialogue, because that trucker spoke in this sort of broken, hillbilly slang, and Jones was a well-spoken, well-educated man, and he intended to play Ben as that kind of character. And he also knew that if he played it, if he read the dialogue as written, he's going to come across as a stereotype, because he was written as a stereotype. And there's one thing that a black man in 1968 does not want to come across, and that's a stereotype, because they were he knows that he's still trying to find his foothold. But black people in 1968, this is the middle of the civil rights era, are trying to find their foothold in film and being presented in a way that's not like the mammy characters from Gone with the Wind,
Right.
Yeah. I mean, what's sad about the whole thing, I mean, I guess it's not really sad, because I think the guy was happy, but Dwayne Jones is kind of he's passed away, unfortunately. I mean, he was only 50 something, but
he had a heart attack pretty young.
Yeah, but he was relatively quiet about it. I mean, he became an educator and worked in New York, and
he was a teacher at the time, but he continued. He acted in a few other films after this, like Ganja and Hess is probably the most well-known movie which is a vampire movie that actually Spike Lee remade as The Sweet Blood of Jesus about 3 or 4 years ago. But yeah, he mostly focused on teaching acting.
Yeah. You can actually sum up his filmography almost on one hand. It's pretty short.
And I did a little digging on him, because I was really curious about this guy, and then being such an iconic part of history. You could find interviews with him, a few that were done here and there, and there's some recorded stuff on YouTube you can hear with him. But it is interesting what you're talking about with the dialogue, because I was listening to him. I was like, he sounds a bit like Barack Obama, almost, like the way his dialogue is delivered. Yeah. Like he almost sounds exactly like him. And he does say, in quotes you'll see from him, is that it never occurred to me that I was hired because I was black, but it did occur to me that because I was black, it would give a different historic element to this film.
Yeah.
And so he was aware of it.
Yeah, exactly.
He described that, Ben as written, I think even Romero described it as the best way they could describe it was he's a little rough around the edges. The example Romero will give in some interviews is that there's the phone scene where Ben walks in and says that he checks the phones, originally as written, it was well, I guess you already done this or something like that. But he comes in and says, well, I suppose you've already tried this. And, so he just delivers it a little more nice. I don't know.
Eloquent, a little more eloquent.
Eloquent. Yeah. That's the word for it.
Yeah. He tells some stories like you said, there aren't a ton of interviews with him. But he does tell stories about how, for instance, there was a time when they were leaving the set and one of the production assistants or somebody was driving him home, and there was a car tailing them, guys hanging out the window with a tire iron. They were following them because they saw a white woman and a black man in a car together. And he knew, I mean, they were, they were in the North, so it was a little more probably progressive than if they'd been shooting in the South, but it was, still he knew the impact of what he was doing.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a shame that he didn't embrace it more later on, although I understand an actor not wanting to be stereotyped or pigeonholed into a horror role, because like I said, his other major well-known role is also another horror film. But he tells a really fun story about when he was in New York years later teaching. Him and some students went out after class one day, and they were outside of a bar or something, and Night of the Living Dead was playing on a television. And he kept kind of glancing up at the TV, and how could you not like a movie with me on it's on the TV? How do you not look at it? But he's kind of glancing up at it, and one of the students actually said, "Oh man, whatever happened to that guy?" And he never told them. He never said,
he never said.
He never said.
No, he never. Yeah, I heard that same story, and it's crazy. And it's like in
wow.
a similar interview where he talks about that. They ask him about like some of his biggest memories from the movie, and it's just he's very self-aware. So I don't want anything that I'm saying to sound like he was a pretentious guy or something, or thought that he was better, because he's often, in a couple of the interviews I read, he makes a point to say, I am grateful for the opportunities I've been given. I know why you're talking to me, and I am respectful of that in my life, but I don't hang everything in my life on that. And so he's self-aware. And so, but they talk about like what's like some of your fondest memories, or what's one of the things that stands out. And like one of his memories is literally, he said one of the things he remembers most is being on the set, and he and Barbara are like hanging out and talking, and like some of the set members, and a butterfly landed on a windowsill, and they were just staring at the butterfly and just thinking,
"Yeah, I've heard this story.
Is a really beautiful butterfly." And then one of the people on the crew thought it would be funny and comes by and just smashes the butterfly.
And everyone's like, "Why the fuck did you do that?"
Yeah, and he said then everyone, in the middle of this zombie movie, in the middle of like all the stuff they're doing, it's just like,
wow.
What the fuck is wrong with you?
Yeah.
Like, why would you kill this beautiful thing? Like, why would you do that? And he just always remembers that moment as like really standing out to him. It's like, despite what the movie is or anything else, it's like that guy killed a butterfly, and they were all just kind of like, wait, what the hell?
Yeah, super bummed out about it.
So moving forward with casting, Romero originally wanted Betty Aberlin, for the role of Barbara.
I was about to say, come on.
Aberlin was better known, of course, as Lady Aberlin on the Pittsburgh-based Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Who, as I mentioned before, the Late Image had done quite a bit of work for them. One kind of famous Romero quote was, he shot the Mr. Rogers Gets a Tonsillectomy segment on one of those early episodes. And Romero has said in multiple interviews, he's like, that was probably the scariest thing I shot for my entire career. But she ended up passing on the role. I don't know why. The author of the book that I read for this, Joe Kane, speculates that maybe Mr. Rogers himself was maybe a little overprotective and didn't want one of his cast members in a horror movie. He doesn't back that up with any facts, but that was sort of his speculation on it, which I could totally see happening. So the role ended up going to Judith O'Dea. She was a young actress. She was actually a voiceover artist, voiceover specialist. And her brother Johnny was played by Night of the Living Dead producer and Latent Image co-founder Russ Streiner.
Well, I'd just like to give a huge shout out to Judith O'Dea for managing to secure the role as one of my least favorite horror movie characters.
I know you hate this role, Gary, and I take some issue with that. I take some issue with that because I get that she is a little bit annoying.
Well, here's the thing.
That is an undersell.
She is going through a traumatic experience. She just saw her brother get murdered. So I think that I feel like you're not giving her the sympathy that is deserved after what she has literally watched her brother get his head smashed on a gravestone, was chased by a corpse, and then continues to be assaulted by the living dead.
Well, part of me for being offended that if you're in a room full of people that are like their survival instinct has kicked in, there's one person that still wants to whine about it.
You don't know how you would react in something like that. Though some people shut down. She is clearly in shock for the entire film. So you could say that, but you could be in that situation, Gary, and shit your pants and be catatonic on the couch for most of the movie like she is.
Well, I hope that that's not true, and I don't appreciate you categorizing me as a person who shit his pants in a zombie apocalypse. But I'd like to think that I would throw that shit at the zombies. I've no doubt if we'd have been talking about eight-legged freaks or arachnophobia, I would have done everyone a favor in either of those movies and just blown my face off. But
you would have been the Barbara of arachnophobia,
right?
So Kat actually, my wife Kat wanted me to ask you guys, is she definitively the most annoying horror movie character of all time, or do you guys think there's somebody else who takes the crown?
I'll tell you what, when I was watching this, I posted an image or something, and I said, "Fuck you, Barbara," or something in my Instagram stories, and I got comments back from women, mind you, that were like, Barbara could suck a fat cock. Like, wow. Things like that. So it wasn't even just like dudes being dudes. Like, it was like actual ladies were responding back like, fuck her. Screw Barbara.
I think Barbara deserves a lot more sympathy than you're giving her. I think that she is she is in shock for the whole movie. And that would happen to a lot of people in this situation. They would go into shock. So I think that giving that just saying that she's being annoying is unfair. I mean, I get that she is not being useful, but a lot of people would not be useful in this situation. Also, I'd rather be in that room with her than with Harry Cooper.
Yeah, true.
That guy's a sure. Also, more annoying horror movie characters, I'm going to say Stu from Scream. And I love Scream, but fuck that guy. Matthew Lillard?
I don't know. He's still kind of funny, at least.
I do quote "live her alone" at least once a week.
I was about to say, he's still got some
at least once a week.
No, none of the one-liners go to any main characters in this movie. It's like, I'm coming to get you, or they're coming to get you, Barbara, and like the sheriff saying they're
all messed up.
They're all messed up. But so that's weird. Like the people that have like 10 minutes of screen time.
It's true, yeah.
Quotable lines. But I don't know. Like I get it. It just she's a lot to handle. And by the way, though, for what it's worth, I mean, this is another example of the interaction between Ben and Barbara is really paramount to like some of the racial tension that was going on at the time. I mean, this is stuff that they where when you hear stories back that these people knew there was something here, at least, because they talk about their stories on the set of like him carrying her and laying her down on the couch and unbuttoning her coat or something, that like they knew immediately when they filmed that there would be like hicks and hillbillies like, oh, he's gonna rape her or something, right. Just like crazy stuff. I read plenty of stories about that, even about where Ben gets slapped by her a couple.
Well, he didn't want to do it.
Yeah, and I think originally in the script he gets slapped like 3 times, and he told them, he's like, "There's no way I'd let this. I'm sorry, but." Dwayne Jones is like, I'm not going to let the white lady hit me in the face 3 times and not hit her back. Like, I'm not.
Yeah.
And he knew, and he didn't want to do the scene where he hits her because he knew that'd be a problem. He had to be talked into it by George Romero.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so just interesting stuff there that like the chemistry, I mean, and you can imagine, I mean, just especially in that time that like the black man and the white woman and stuff, it's weird. It's I mean, I want to say it's hard to believe now, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So the roles of Harry and Helen Cooper, those went to Carl Hardman and Marilyn Eastman, who we mentioned earlier. Hardman, who was a producer on the film, ran the company Hardman Associates, where at Hardman Associates he employed a 19-year-old receptionist named Judith Ridley. Ridley had been considered for the role of Barbara, but she ended up being assigned the role of Judy, and Ridley was not an actress. She even will fully admit that she's not particularly good in the movie, honestly. But she'll admit that. She's in Romero's follow-up film, There's Always Vanilla, as well, and she says the same thing about that too.
It's funny though, just because I do see that same thing, and I just don't. She didn't stand out to me, honestly.
She's not horrible, but she's not good. She's better than the guy who plays Tom.
Right.
Yeah.
Who's really bad and never appeared in another movie before. After this, I'm sorry, never appeared in another movie. So he's literally done one. But one of course, the most iconic roles in the film was played by Carl Hardman's real-life daughter, Kira Shawn, who he plays the Cooper's daughter in the film, the little girl who gets turned into a zombie, and she sort of became the de facto mascot for the film. She's on the posters. If you buy a Night of the Living Dead t-shirt, she's on the t-shirt. She's on the cover of the VHS or the DVD or whatever. It's usually her. Pretty much anything associated with the film is kind of designed around her face.
Yeah,
she kind of became the iconic image from the movie.
There's something to her. I mean, even to this day, like watching it literally 2 days ago when I watched it or whatever, it just, there's something about her that is extra, just, it's a little bit more than everyone else. And I don't know that it's just the little girl part of it or daughter or, you know, like matricide or whatever you call it.
Well, I think that's a big part of it because that is a truly shocking scene, even in 1968. I mean, that seeing a little girl murder her mother and eating her father like that, and for audiences in 1968, that was like very shocking. It still has an impact today.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it's easy to say like, oh, in 1968, you can imagine this like blows their minds. But even now, like watching that part of it, like that's one of the more visceral, like, hard scenes in the film. It still works.
And she does have some sort of an undefinable, eerie, photogenic quality that it's understandable why she's so iconic in terms of that image related to this film.
Absolutely. So the next step, of course, was they had to cast a bunch of ghouls. That's what Romero called them in this film, not zombies. Like I said, he didn't know he was making a zombie movie. He called them ghouls. So they needed to get a bunch of people to dress up as dead corpses, basically. The movie employed about 250 ghouls in all. A lot of those were played by volunteers from Evans City, Pennsylvania, which is where they were filming, who were just excited to be in a movie. They were just volunteers. They weren't really getting paid. They just were like, hey, we're making a movie. I want to be in a movie. There's a really fun documentary that interviews a lot of the people who played ghouls in the film that you can find online. It's really fun. It's called not Document of the Dead. I can't fucking remember. I didn't write it down.
It just sounds like another one of the Romero zombie films.
Well, there are portions of that documentary that are special features on the Criterion release of Night of the Living Dead. So you can find them on there, which is where I saw it. So some of the ghouls were played by actors who played other roles in the film. You know, you've got, of course, you had someone that needed to, you had to have somebody who actually would turn them from humans into ghouls. And with, Tom Savini's off in Vietnam, he couldn't do it. So the job went to Marilyn Eastman, the actress who played Helen Cooper. And she used this like clay that they use that morticians use on dead bodies to like, reshape. I don't fucking know whether to reshape their face, whatever morticians do. But they use that as for some of the like gore effects and things like that. So very kind of lo-fi version of what Savini would later do. But, for the film, it works.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, you reshape the bone structure, or you make big gaping wounds with it, or just make it look like the skin's sort of rotting away, and you can turn one actor into several.
Or just give them those cheekbones they always wish they had.
So with all the pieces in place, the filmmakers were ready to start shooting. Unfortunately, by the time they had all the pieces in place, it was the middle of winter in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania winters are not particularly forgiving. They are hard on the cast and crew, of course, but also on the equipment. At one point, Romero and Russo took the camera out for a little test shoot, and the camera's motor froze completely from the cold. So they're like, okay, maybe we should wait a little bit and do this later on. So shooting finally commenced in June of 1967 under the name Night of the Flesh Eaters. That was later changed to Night of Anubis, like the Egyptian god of death. And then, of course, was changed later on before the film got released. The film shot for about 30 days. But those days it wasn't like 30 consecutive days. Those were 30 days spread out mostly on weekends for a period of about 7 months. So they shot for quite a while. The majority of the shoot was filmed on old 35 millimeter, an Arriflex camera. Now, that's not something we normally want to get into. That's the equipment used can be kind of boring, you know. But the reason I mention it here is because the type of camera is notable in this case because an Arriflex is a pretty small camera. It holds a much smaller film reel, about 100 feet of film as opposed to a more traditional movie camera, which holds about 400 feet. So it could be carried on the shoulder. They could carry it around, and that ability contributes to the look of the film and that kind of documentary handheld feel that you get to so many of the scenes in the movie.
Yeah, it definitely lends to the authenticity of it.
Well, yeah, and I saw like with like budget. I mean, this may be sort of. I mean, it's obviously sort of related, but you know, I read some stuff about how they were shooting on 35 millimeter print, and you couldn't even really edit on that size print at that time, and it was something like they would have to transfer the footage to 16 millimeter to do actual edits. So they were just kind of trusting that George was just getting the right shot that the whole time that it was, you know, I think that was an interview I saw with Russo where he talks about like they just had to kind of go by his vision that he knew what he was getting.
Hope that it was framed correctly.
Right.
Huh. And another choice that they made was using black and white film. That was more of an aesthetic choice than a budgetary one, although that was obviously going to be a deciding factor as well because black and white is much cheaper. But that using black and white helped to further the stark, like cinema verite style that they were going for in the film. And it also helped with the application of makeup because, for one, if the makeup color, like the color of the prosthetic was a little off from the actor's skin color, it's not going to show so much on black and white. But also, like in the case of the blood scene in the film, depending on what they needed the blood to do, they would either use red ink or they would use Bosco chocolate syrup. So for some of the scenes you see it's chocolate syrup, and on black and white they read as the same color.
You know what's funny about that is I actually didn't know this, so this is interesting. I was curious, and I meant to look it up before, and I never did. That, you know, was color like a pretty popular option during that time or whatever?
For sure, yeah.
And I you know,
in 1968, color was very much the norm. Honestly.
Well, I'm an idiot. I don't know. So I was like, when did it happen? I don't know.
Well, I mean, even in 1960, when Hitchcock shot Psycho, he had already shot color films. He shot Psycho in black and white. That was an aesthetic choice that Hitchcock made when he shot Psycho. And
the reason I bring it up is I read like an essay about Night of the Living Dead, and one of the things it compliments the movie on is the choice to shoot in black and white. It was saying that to a lot of viewers at the time, it said in 68, still a lot of news broadcasts were done in black and white. And it talked about that this would give it more of a documentary feel and important that it was like set in a realistic environment.
Sure. And people's television sets at home were in black and white.
Right.
You know, so you were seeing color on the big screen, but that gives it that newsreel feel because people were used to seeing newsreels in black and white.
And with the handheld camera, this was dangerously close to being like a found footage type film.
I mean, it's got that feel to it for sure.
Yeah.
So once the decision was made to shoot in black and white, Romero decided he'd go for kind of a Val Lewton vibe for the film. And Val Lewton is someone that we will definitely explore later on this podcast because I think he's one of the foundational pieces of horror. But what Romero did is he used what's called gobos, which are basically black and white, or I'm sorry, it's black paper with like shapes cut out so that you get this really dramatic lighting that wouldn't occur naturally in any other way. So that's kind of what they did on this film. Shooting in intervals, you know, over the course of 7 months also added to the difficulties of shooting because there were times, you know, weeks they wouldn't be at the farmhouse for a week and vandals would break in and they'd break windows. They would mess with these mannequins. They had these mannequins that were stored there that they would dress up as ghouls to put in like the backgrounds of some scenes. So the vandals would fuck with those and stuff. But there were also times when shooting was more regular, so regular, in fact, and so chaotic that a lot of the principal cast and crew members camped out in the farmhouse. Now, this is a farmhouse. It's old, but it's got no modern amenities. There's no running water, for one thing. There's no heating and air. They would actually have to use, there was a nearby well that they would actually have to gather water from just so that they could flush the toilets in the farmhouse. So it was, kind of a rough time every now and then on shooting.
Yeah, there's stories with like Russo having to like boil. He talks about boiling water every night and that sort of thing. And yeah, like you said, like the sleeping on cots and stuff like that.
The overlaps of this and the story of the production of the first Evil Dead movie are getting bigger.
Yeah, I mean it's a very, very similar production in that it's very, very homemade. Although I think this had a slightly bigger crew probably than the Evil Dead did.
They talk about Russo talked about having to take cat baths every night or whatever, and
that's where you lick yourself.
I think that's what I was just wondering. But I had that quote. But they said that Romero like never did laundry; he just bought new clothes.
That's one way to do it, I guess.
I guess.
Don't knock a cat bath until you try it.
And you're talking about the interval thing. I mean, there's instances where I think, God, I wish I could remember the scene now, but they talk about like two people are like both facing left to like talk to each other. And
yeah, that's there are a few moments in the film, actually quite a few, where there are mistakes, and that's a big one actually. Although I didn't notice that for the longest time. I don't know how many times I've seen this movie, but the line of sight, like where one person's looking and another person, normally there's a line of sight where you want those to line up where it looks like they're looking at each other. But there's a scene, like specifically, there's a big one where Ben is talking to Harry and they're both like they're not looking at each other. So,
right.
And that happens a lot. Like there's one where Ben is talking about, oh, now we've got all the windows boarded up. We're good to go. He's talking to Barbara, and there's clearly an unboarded window in the background.
Yeah.
So little things like that. But again, this is a bunch of first-time crew members.
Well, I mean, that's how Romero writes. Oh, he's saying, what do you want me to do? We didn't have a way to keep track of that stuff.
Yeah,
so that's how it happens.
So, of course, aside from the zombie makeup, there were other special effects that they had to consider, mostly the gore. So for the ghouls feast on Tom and Judy, they call it the Last Supper or something like that, I think is what they referred to it as, where you just had these multiple shots of zombies eating entrails. The meat being eaten was all lamb organs. So one of the film's investors was actually a guy who owned a local meat market chain. He was a butcher. So he just had all this, extra livers and shit lying around. So he donated them to the cast and crew. And so when you see these extras and these people who are dressed up as ghouls biting into like a liver, they're biting into a raw lamb liver. That's dedication.
Well, when that stuff, when they're talking about the farmhouse, like sleeping in the farmhouse, I remember like one of the stories from Russo was like waking up and like he just like woke up and walked out one of the mornings, and Vincent Stravinsky is sitting on the front porch and he's pouring water down lamb intestines.
Yeah, they filled them with water to make them look like more plump and juicy.
Yeah, he's like, this makes it more cinematic. And he's just like, he said he just like turns around and is like, now who wants to film an indie movie?
So Vince Stravinsky, who you're talking about, the production designer, he had a brother named Regis Stravinsky, who was a professional fireworks expert, along with a partner of his. They had a explosives company, basically. And they rigged bullet squibs in the zombies. Now, squibs, if you're unaware, they're very common now. They're very small explosive charges, usually attached to little blood bags, so that like somebody gets shot, it looks like a hole going into them. Although those are pretty common now, although these days a lot of people are doing CGI squibs, which suck.
Right.
But they were pretty rare at the time, especially in something as low budget as Night of the Living Dead. They would be used heavily in Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde. which had not been released at the time that night was being filmed, although it came out earlier. The end of that movie, there's a pretty heavy use of squibs, and then would be further popularized in excessive use in Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which came out in 1969. And then, of course, there was the film's biggest effect of all, which was the exploding truck. So Regis Servinsky rigged up an old panel truck. It's the truck that they bought for like $45. And they basically just kept trying out different things till they got the result they wanted. But he basically made a bomb on this truck, and they filled the truck with like old wood and carpet and things like that, so they would have debris to explode. And they only had one take because they only had one truck. So Romero set up like 3 different cameras so that he could make sure that he properly captured the explosion. And honestly, it looks great on film. I think it's for a film that is as small as this, it's a pretty impressive special effect.
That particular effect, the exploding truck, was something I've noticed because I just, I didn't go over any notes or read the Wikipedia page before sitting down to watch this again. But I knew it was a low budget, and seeing that, I was like, that was probably pretty expensive. So yeah, it does look really good.
It's $45 and some bombs.
Nice.
I don't know what bombs cost.
Yeah, neither do I. I don't know. Gary doesn't know. None of us here at Cinema Shock know how much bombs cost.
I never blow up nothing.
So for another potential even more dangerous scene, they needed Carl Hardman, Harry Cooper, to toss Molotov cocktails at zombies. There's a scene where Ben's running out and he's tossing them from the upper floor. So how did they achieve this effect, you might be wondering? Well, they had Carl Hardman toss Molotov cocktails at zombies. Well, people playing zombies. Nobody ever thought to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe somebody's going to get hurt. Maybe somebody's going to catch on fire.
Yeah.
Luckily, only one person caught on fire, and it was actually on purpose. So John Russo decided, he's like, if somebody doesn't catch on fire, this scene's not going to be believable. All these, you've got these slow-moving ghouls shambling towards the fire. One of them's got to hit a zombie and catch him on fire. So he volunteered to be that zombie. He's like, I'll do it. John Russo, by the way, not a stuntman. I mean, he's an actor. He's a producer. He's not a stuntman. He's not wearing any protective gear. I think he wore a couple extra layers underneath his suit or whatever, but he's not wearing like fire retardant gel like modern day stuntmen would wear. They just literally set the guy on fire. And then he's like, when I started feeling really hot, I just dropped on the ground. Stop, drop, and roll. They threw some blankets on me and put it out. That was their form of stunt work on this film.
Wow.
I mean, that's really how, like, even today, though, like, fire scenes go.
Those guys are slathered in film retardant gel.
Well, yeah. I mean, like, yes, you're right. I'm sorry. No, I just watched like a whole thing about Kane Hodder. So I don't know, for some reason it was in my brain, and they talks about even through the gel, like when you feel hot, drop. Like that's what it's supposed to happen, because the weird thing about flames he talks about is like fire stunts. It's like, and that it can burn long after the flame is actually gone, oddly enough. So he's like, even if he's like, the second you feel hot at a fire stunt, you have to like immediately signal, because like even once they put it out, it can still somehow burn you. And it's just interesting. I don't know. We'll have to get Kane on sometime.
Yeah, we'll do that. So I should, I guess, say that Russo was the only one to be caught on fire in that particular scene. Gary Striner of the Striner Brothers, the film sound man, who one day he just happened to be working as like basically an impromptu prop master. And he was in charge of preparing the chair that Ben sets on fire and kicks out the door, and he sets himself on fire on accident.
Oh, Gary. Jesus.
Yeah, those fucking Garys. Luckily, Bill Hensman, the guy who plays the cemetery zombie at the beginning of the film, who was another member of the Image 10, he was on set, and he actually like tackled Steinman and put out the fire before he could really be hurt. But
jeez,
Yeah, he just accidentally said, I mean, that's what happens when you literally like squirt a bunch of lighter fluid on a chair and then set it on fire.
Yeah.
So what was happening is he was actually supposed to be adding more flammable liquid, lighter fluid or gas, whatever they're using, to the fire. And of course, the fire jumped up the stream and caught him on fire. So luckily he was okay.
Nice.
When this,
You always got to be careful crossing the streams.
when this
Thank you, Tom.
truck blows up, they're eating ham covered in chocolate sauce, and
I think it was ground ham.
Yeah.
Or ground burger or something, which
And,
sounds disgusting.
Yeah, well, it was for the people, especially eating it, and the filmmakers, like in some of the stuff, like joke about that. We almost didn't have to use makeup because they were all just like white and pale anyway. Just, like, terrible, like just munching on this shit.
So although a lot of the members of the Latent Image were skilled in various aspects of film production, like we said, you've got a guy doing sound and doing a prop master. You've got someone editing, shooting, directing. Everyone's doing all kinds of things. None of them were musicians, but they tried. Like they tried to create their own film. They had like Russo on the drums, and they couldn't afford to hire anyone to do an original score for the film. So they were like, we've done everything else ourselves. Let's try to do this. It didn't work. And they realized it wasn't going to work. So what they ended up doing is using library music. That was something that was kind of common in the 40s and 50s, where studios would have like archives of music that you could buy. And it was a lot cheaper than the cost of getting an original score recorded. So Hardman and Romero, they work with Capitol Records, and they get all these scores, all this music, and basically they have to sift through all of it and use it in the film and figure out how it works.
Jeez.
And it's pretty impressive because the music in this works really well.
Yeah.
They did a great job. Romero seems to get most of the credit for it, but he has a hell of an ear for how music works in a film, because to use somebody else's film music in the way that he uses it here is very impressive.
Well, he talks about a lot. Like he refers to it as needle drops, which we've used or will use on the show multiple times, I'm sure. Yeah. But he talks about like you could pay for like where the needle drops to like where you pick it up or something like it.
Right.
But he described it like, I mean, in one of the interviews I saw with him, I mean, it must have been 2012, that he was saying he still did it to that day. Like every time he films anything, he sits down and plays with needle drops.
I think even with Dawn of the Dead, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks, he had an original score recorded for it, but then still ended up using a lot of archive music.
Yeah, well, and the producer of that was Argento, who wanted to use Goblin stuff.
We'll get into that in a few weeks.
Yeah, we'll get into all of that.
Save it.
He in the interview I saw, he did discuss like having arguments about like that with Argento. Like, no, I do it this way. And he's like, no, you use Goblin. Hey, I'm going to make it anyway. You just use what you want to use.
Always use Goblin.
But anyway, yeah, he was doing that till his deathbed. Like he would throw music on top of it. He's like, you use your favorite tracks, whatever. Just like
shit. Kubrick did it with 2001.
Yeah, he said. I mean, he's like, I just never liked showing my film naked. I assume he was still talking about like the movie without music.
Not he was naked while showing the film,
right? But
although,
I mean, maybe it would have gone over better.
Not kink shaming anyone.
No,
if you like showing your film while undressed, please do.
No, actually, don't do that unless the person is.
We'll hold special screenings.
Yeah, if the person that you're showing it to has consented.
Yeah.
Don't be a Louis C.K.
Right.
That's a good point. Yeah, just don't.
Louis C.K. presents
Night
of the Living Dead.
When in doubt, ask yourself, what would Louis C.K. do? And don't do that.
Go the other way. Just go the other way.
By the way, we're relaunching the website. Also, we'll have a merchandise store. We'll have some WWLCK bracelets.
Oh,
So after a 5-month-long editing process by Romero himself, Night of the Living Dead was ready to be released. But first, they needed somebody to release it. They needed a distributor. So the filmmakers, well, at first they aimed pretty high. They took it to Columbia Pictures. They were very close to offering a deal to release the film. But they and a lot of other studios turned it down mostly because it was in black and white. They didn't think that was marketable. Even American International Pictures, this is that Sam Arkoff's company that was known for releasing exploitation drive-in movies, a lot of Roger Corman's films of the 1950s, even he turned it down. And one of the main reasons that they couldn't work out a deal is because AIP wanted the ending change. They wanted Ben to survive. And Romero would not budge on that.
We didn't want to restore order. The whole reason for doing the piece is to kick normal in the butt. I've never understood why you'd want to bring things back to normal after you've upset the apple cart so much.
That was an actual recording of George Romero.
Yeah, weird. We found that.
They got a little bit better luck with Continental Releasing, which was owned by Walter Reed Productions. And that was a company that was known really for more art house fare than for its exploitation films. In fact, I think Night of the Living Dead was its first quote unquote like exploitation movie. And instead of trying to soften the film like Columbia had and AIP, they actually wanted more gore. They're like, we have more cannibalism scenes? They literally asked for that. And they had a few that were on the cutting room floor that they inserted back into the movie because they wanted that.
And it's important to note here, I mean, we kind of touched on it a little bit. I mean, this is a different time. I mean, the gore in this movie is pretty fantastical. Like, it's outstanding for the amount of gore that people are used to seeing in this time period. I mean, these zombies are, even to this day, like just knowing even what they're eating on and movie magic, blah, 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 it's still kind of like disturbing. Like they're just like chowing down on some flesh and bone. Like they're just really getting after it.
Yeah.
So with a distributor in place, the Image 10 crew, they held a premiere for the film at the Fulton Theater in downtown Pittsburgh on October 1st, 1968. And it was a hit with the hometown crowd. Of course, everyone was excited to see this movie filmed in their own backyard. But the filmmaker still wondered, would it play in other areas? Would it play as well in other areas? So over the next few days, Continentals and Image 10, they started playing the film in drive-ins around in kind of the nearby surrounding areas, and it always drew pretty good crowds. It eventually began opening up in more cities. It never got like a major wide release, but it kind of gradually moved around the country, and it always drew pretty healthy crowds and mostly positive reviews. There were, however, some reviewers who did not consider it the instant classic that we might think of it as. Now, Variety's review said that the film, it's a quote, raised doubts about the future of the regional cinema movement and the moral health of filmgoers who cheerfully opt for unrelieved sadism.
Love it.
So just put that on the poster.
Yes. I mean, I would go see the movie because of that.
Yeah.
Listen,
Roger,
man, I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. I got it.
You got a point. Roger Ebert's review of the film, he did a big piece about kids running, crying from the theater. His review described a lot of the gore in detail. It actually spoiled the ending of the movie. But his review, and he didn't dislike the movie. It was more about the presentation, because sometimes the film would be in double features with movies that maybe were attracting kids that this should not be seeing this movie. Mm-hmm. So he actually later wrote that he actually did appreciate the film, but his review was more about the experience of being in the theater at the time.
Yeah,
and, it's scaring kids and it's making kids cry, and that actually ended up drawing more attention and more business to the film.
So here's where I wanted to jump in, really, because Ebert's review, I had it pulled up here because I loved reading his review, even though he fucking spoils it. I don't get
He spoils the shit out of it. Spoils Ben's death at the end of the movie.
Yeah. But he says here, it's hard to remember what sort of effect this movie might have had on you when you were 6 or 7. But try to remember, at that age, kids take the events on the screen seriously, and they identify fiercely with the hero. When the hero is killed, that's not an unhappy ending, but a tragic one. Nobody got out alive. It's just over. That's all. I felt real terror in the neighborhood theater last Saturday afternoon. I saw kids who had no resources they could draw upon to protect themselves from the dread and fear they felt. But he does go on to say, censorship isn't the answer to something like this. Censorship is never the answer. For that matter, Night of the Living Dead was passed for general audiences by the Chicago Police Censor Board. It says it had no nudity in it. It was all right for kids, I guess. This is another example.
It does have fucking nudity in it, Raj.
This is another example, I guess, and there have been a lot of them, of the incompetence and stupidity of the censorship system that Chicago stubbornly maintains under political patronage.
How did he miss the naked zombie?
Yeah, I don't know. Censorship is not the answer, but I would be ashamed to make a civil libertarian argument defending the right of those little girls and boys to see a film which left a lot of them stunned with terror. In a case like this, I'd want to know what their parents were thinking of when they dumped their kids in front of the theater to see a film titled Night of the Living Dead.
He's got a point.
What I do appreciate about that, that's exactly where I wanted to go, by the way. I just think the world needs to hear that, by the way, that Roger Ebert's like, this movie is not for kids. But he's still like leaving it on the parents at the parents' feet. Like, why did you bring your kids to a movie called Night of the Living Dead?
It's called Night of the Living Dead. What do you think it's going to be about?
What are these kids doing here?
The naked zombie, by the way, I should side note that he failed to see in the film, I guess. They hired like an artist model for that. And the day that they filmed that, they had everyone from that little town in Pennsylvania like setting up lawn chairs and shit on the side of the road to watch that scene being filmed.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really the story, right? I mean, he even says in his review, he talks a little bit about how, well, obviously the idea was that, he talks about that there's the MPAA coming in, the code
Sure.
that would probably regulate this sort of thing. And
luckily they were not around quite yet.
And he said it seemed like this was rushed to get it in there before this happened. He talks about it in this review that, like, I mean, yeah, they want to make a quick buck on a movie that seems off limits for children. While they still can, they want to do it. So all of this stuff just reminds me of like modern day stuff. Is why I brought it up. I mean, not to get too political, but it just seems like modern day stuff that, like, yeah, they're trying to make some money while they can. I don't know. I just love the idea that even back then this was an issue, and even he here is saying, like, you can't censor this stuff. Censorship generally has the exact opposite result of what you want to have from it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the film continued to play in thousands of theaters over its the course of its life in the theater, often for weeks or even months-long stretches. It appeared as part of a double feature in some markets. Like, it was paired with Doctor Who and the Daleks for a little while, which is a little spin-off film.
Yeah.
Who, which is an odd pairing. And then later it was paired with Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, which makes a little more sense. Continental tried to capitalize on the racial subtext of the film as it continued to play all the way into 1970. The film's still playing in theaters around the country, but they would split it on double bills with straight up blaxploitation films. Like, they at that point had fully embraced the racial aspects of the film.
Wow.
And then in early 1971, this is over 2 years after the film was initially released, there was a theater in Washington, D.C. that started playing it at midnight. And that sort of kickstarted a trend that really reached its peak at New York City's Waverly Theater, where it stayed for about 2 years. Again, this is at the time that Dwayne Jones is teaching in New York City. So he's walking by this theater fairly regularly and seeing Night of the Living Dead up on the marquee.
That's awesome. Did they do stuff like Rocky Horror Picture Show where people were like, is there anything like that for this?
You mean like audience participation stuff?
Yeah,
I don't think so. I don't think that stuff. I think Rocky Horror mostly kicked off that kind of trend.
Okay.
The true midnight movie would not be really established for a couple more years after this, with the release of films like El Topo and Eraserhead. Those were kind of the first midnight movies, but this was sort of the genesis of that movement.
Oh, okay.
So the movie ended up making a lot of money for Continental. It was doing really well, but Romero and the rest of the Image 10 crew wasn't seeing much of that money, if any at all. And they ended up taking the distributor to court, saying that, hey, you guys owe us money from ticket sales. The case dragged on for years and years until finally the distribution rights just ended up reverting back to Image 10 when Continental's parent company, Walter Reed, went bankrupt in 1978.
Mm.
And then around that time, they had another shocking realization, was that their film did not have a legal copyright on it. So what happened when the film was first completed, their 35 millimeter print had the title Night of the Flesh Eaters. That was what it was going to be released as. But they had to change it because they were threatened by a lawyer who represented the clients who had made a film in 1964 just called The Flesh Eaters. So they had to change it quickly. So Continental released the film. They changed the title to Night of the Living Dead, which honestly is a better title, I think, anyway. But they didn't include the copyright on the title when they struck new prints. So as a result, the film remains to this day in public domain. Now, that law about a decade later was changed. And normally you'd put the copyright at the end of the film anyway, but in this case it was on like the title at the beginning. There was that little C and little copyright. But now that this would never have happened now because the copyright laws have changed. But because it happened before the laws changed, even now, nobody really owns the rights to Night of the Living Dead.
Always double check your documents, double check your prints, guys.
Thank you, says the guy who works in law.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. Like, there's part of me that, I mean, I appreciate having complete access and like we can upload this movie to the YouTube channel right now. And I feel like very strongly we just should, just because what's it going to hurt? But I mean, I feel bad that none of these guys have the right to their art. There's a part of me that after a while that like, you know, after like 50 years, maybe the public should just have access to it anyway. But I don't know. Yeah, it's a tough thing for George. Luckily things worked out for Romero.
But I mean, it's still a tragedy. I mean, this is one of the most influential films of all time, and none of the people involved in the blood, sweat, and tears that went into it made a dime off of it. And that's
true. And you got to think about guys like, I mean, now that you say that, I think about Dwayne over there.
I mean, the actors got paid for their work, but you know,
should he still at least get like a stipend like every time like the movie showed somewhere or something?
Residuals, yeah,
residuals, yeah.
But and I called this influential. The word influential gets thrown around a lot on classic films, and often with good reason. You know, a lot of times you call something influential and it deserves it. But how many films can be credited as starting an entire subgenre that's as pervasive in our society as the zombie subgenre?
Yeah, very, very few.
I mean, think about it. Like in modern terms, Resident Evil, 28 Days Later, Shaun of the Dead, The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, for a very recent example. None of those would exist. Not a single one of those would exist without George Romero's Night of the Living Dead.
Oh, yeah. 100%. I mean, in the documentary Birth of the Living Dead, Gail Ann Hurd, who is the producer of The Walking Dead, like she straight up says the blueprint we used for the zombies is based on Night of the Living Dead.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the craziest part about that is that this was an accident. George Romero had no intention of creating a new genre of film. He was just trying to make a cheap little movie that would make his small production house a quick buck so they could make the art movies that they really wanted to make. And then another happy accident that the film is often credited for is that of its social commentary, especially in regards to race. Now, I'm not saying that all of the social commentary is accidental. If you watch any of George Romero's other films, then you know that that's sort of his thing, trying to say something through genre. But on this particular film, Romero was always adamant that it was unintentional. But unintentional or not, we touched on this a little bit earlier, casting Dwayne Jones as Ben, the subtext creates itself. I mean, there was no way you could cast a black man in this role and it not make some sort of statement.
You know who does a really good job is like Guillermo del Toro. There's an interview you can find on YouTube, and I apologize, I don't remember exactly where it's at.
It's on the Criterion release.
Yeah, but I mean, like you can look it up. Guillermo del Toro interviewing George Romero, and George Romero is like very humble about it or whatever, passive about like, I didn't mean to blah, blah, blah. And Guillermo del Toro is very adamant about like, yeah, but like you make a decision like this and you as an artist, you're imprinting yourself on this work.
Right.
So we're seeing your politics in this, whether you want it or not. Like, it's there, and you did what you did.
Well, at the time, like that's telling, because at the time, just casting a black guy in the role without even it being, without it, having second thought about it, that's a political statement in 1968 America.
Yeah.
Right.
Just making that decision without it being a big deal to you, because Romero was and always was a very like liberal, progressive thinker. So that is a statement, even if the original script didn't have that, implanted in it.
Yeah.
So even from a structural standpoint, like Ben's introduction is pretty significant, because the film begins with Johnny and Barbara in the graveyard. Then after Johnny's death, Barbara flees, and the audience is left kind of rooting for her as if she is the film's protagonist. In any other film, she would be your main character.
I was about to say the same thing. Yeah, like she should be the final girl, basically.
You've got all the information you need to assume that she's the main character. You've got her backstory. You know why she's at the graveyard. You get stories about her family, her mother, her brother, her father. This is all establishing her as a character. And then Ben just shows up out of nowhere, no backstory, no nothing. He's just there in the house, right?
Yeah.
We don't know who he is. We don't know his story. We get a little bit of the story of how he got to the farmhouse with his monologue later on, but even that leaves out any details of his backstory before the events of the film, right?
Yeah.
And he's telling that story really as a way to confront, to comfort Barbara, who is in shock. She's catatonic at this point. But all that kind of changes when Ben slaps her, the scene that we talked about earlier. He tries to slap her back to reality, something that, of course, was unheard of in 1968, a black man slapping a white woman. The closest parallel would probably be in The Heat of the Night, which came out a year earlier, where Sidney Poitier slaps a racist plantation owner. That was the only kind of parallel, but even Barbara being a woman makes this have even a little bit more impact than that. And also, she's not a racist. Like the other guy in The Heat of the Night, he's just a fucking asshole and deserves it. But she just needs to chill the fuck out, basically.
Right. Well, I mean, it was funny because when Kat and I were watching this and that happens, Kat was like, "Yeah, there you go."
Yeah.
And it's just like, "Wait, babe, what are you saying?" What? And she's like, "Well, she's losing her shit." I'm like, "Okay, yeah. I mean, sometimes you got to do what you got to do."
Romero quickly establishes Ben as the hero of the movie. I mean, he's smart and capable. He's ready to take action. He's very calm amidst all the chaos of the film. Night of the Living Dead is essentially Ben's story. And we mentioned this before, but consider the time at which the movie was released. In the midst of the civil rights movement, like Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in April of 1968, and this movie is released in October. Seeing a black man in a film tormented by a mob of white zombies before being killed by law enforcement resonated with audiences, whether that was Romero's intent or not.
Right.
There was supposedly a dispute on that, like the ending, that there was an idea that we shouldn't kill off everybody.
But I think that they made the right decision.
Yeah,
I mean, it's nihilistic, but
yeah.
Supposedly, Dwayne was saying that if you let this guy live, and then he's saved by the white cops, or basically, essentially, I mean, this is so crazy. Just I guess considering the situation we're in right now, it's just interesting that he had that discussion with them on the set. That was a story I read about, that he was like, for black audiences, this is not going to feel the same if you just let him die.
Yeah.
Here,
well,
as if that if he's just rescued by this group of white cops coming in or whatever, the white military or whatever, he's like, it's not going to feel the same as if he should also die here.
Right. So, and there was a 2017 interview in the New York Times with Jordan Peele. He was promoting Get Out, and he talks about the influence of Romero's film and Romero's sort of statement that he wasn't trying to make a comment on race. But here's what Jordan Peele said. He said, "I partially believe Romero, and But even if that's true, the way the movie handles race is so essential to what makes it great. All social norms break down when the event happens, and a black man is caged up in a house with a white woman who is terrified. We are not sure how much she's terrified of the monsters on the outside or this man on the inside who is now the hero. And also, the end of the movie, that's nothing if it's a white dude.
Yeah.
I think he's absolutely right. I think,
you can't say it better than that.
I mean, Romero is a great filmmaker, and I have no doubts that Night of the Living Dead would have been very good, even if a white guy had been cast as Ben. But it loses a lot of power. I don't know that it would be the classic that we're still talking about 52 years later without that. Like, audiences may have flocked to it at the time, but I don't know if it would have the staying power that it had a white man been cast in that role.
I think you're 100% right, but also one of the things that I think really works for it is even if Romero is not thinking about the long-term, like, lasting effects of this thing, one of the cool parts about it is actually because of that, it's not that he makes, like, it's not that he, like, purposely set out to, like, we got to get a black guy as the hero and we got to give him black power and we got to give him, like, some kind of special, like, he's just extra charismatic and just, like, great. It's like, no, this is a role and the black guy is the best actor for this. He wasn't even thinking about that, it sounds like. It was just like, this is the man that is best suited to fill this role. And even in the movie, the character of Ben, despite everything we've said, doesn't have, like, any special abilities. In fact, you could argue he's wrong throughout the movie. Like, I mean, he doesn't always make the best decisions. He just takes charge in the situation. He does send the lady back down to the basement where her daughter's going to murder her later. And then he ends up holding up in the basement when he's, like, refused to go there the whole time. So it's not as though he's, like, you know, I am the ultimate in truth and power. Like, he's a dude in this situation like everyone else. He is the same as you. And so I don't know, maybe that's not the same for everybody, but that's one of the cool things I enjoyed about it too. It's just like in 68, people weren't looking at black people this same way. But it's like, this is another human being in the same scenario as you. And he's going through this whole time trying to relate to Barbara, God help her, who's a fucking moron the entire time. He's trying to work with her.
Well, the wife and I have been going through a couple different graphic novels each week, just kind of, you know, eating and talking and, you know, reading, trying to disconnect from some screens every now and then. But what we've talked about is being able to, the idea of iconography and being able to project yourself onto a character. And I think, you know, for the time that this was made and having a black guy as your lead, every person wants to see themselves as the hero. So I think this started breaking some molds of, you know, the person you're projecting yourself onto doesn't look like you. And it makes you think of things like, you know what, it doesn't always have to look like me. It doesn't always have to be this one particular thing, and that anybody's capable of doing these things. And just like Gary just finished saying, he doesn't make all the right decisions, which when you look at him next to guys like John McClane, who maybe doesn't make all the greatest decisions, but you're right there with him. And I think, because if it wasn't done intentionally, it was at least done correctly.
Yeah. Well, here's what I think, Todd. Like, I think what happens in film, or what should happen in film, people get up in arms about this stuff. Like, people are mad. Like, God help them. Idiots are mad about, like, the Black Panther movie coming out and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But I think the dream is that it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
That's the idea that you're working towards. And then it's like, you know, I think part of the step is that you get to a point where, like, movies like Black Panther happen, that, like, an all black cast, like a predominantly black cast happens to show that, like, hey, these they're black and they can act, and like it's okay, like it's fine. Black people can sell movies. Like it almost seems dirty even saying it, because why is that a discussion? But,
Right.
Well, the reason that it's a discussion is because for years and years and years, Hollywood did not represent black people on film. So them being represented is significant. This kind of builds on what Todd was saying, how, you can look at a film and you can watch Night of the Living Dead and you can see, hey, the hero doesn't have to look like me, right? But for black kids watching this movie, being able to see a hero that does look like them is incredibly significant, especially in 1968, because that was not happening aside from like those Sidney Poitier movies. And those were mostly all him going up against racist dudes, right? Well, it wasn't until the blaxploitation films that came out a few years after that Hollywood truly embraced having black heroes in films.
I want to be clear that I get that. Yeah. Like I'm saying, like, it is an important step, and it's the step that has to happen, because you have to show, like, this can happen. It's okay. Like, it sucks that you have to prove it, because it should just be a given. Yeah. But here we are. We live in a world where you got to prove it, I guess. And so, and I don't mean that cynically. I mean, just like, no, I'm glad. I love Black Panther. I'm glad it exists. And I absolutely agree it exists. But you want the world. I think the dream is that you want the world that it's like Miles Morales exists, because who gives a fuck what color Spider-Man is?
Right.
Like, it's like if race is not, if you're not playing a white supremacist, then it shouldn't matter what color of skin you have. Like,
I mean, that is true, but there's a whole hours-long conversation you could have about the importance of representation on film, because you have, I mean, especially if you're telling, like in the Night of the Living Dead is not necessarily this case, but if you're telling stories that are from a black perspective, then obviously that's a very important representation. And
well, sure. I just mean the dream is to eventually get there. I mean, obviously there are certain situations that, like, I mean, if you're playing a role that requires like a certain upbringing, then sure.
Because just saying that, like, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't care what color the person is, almost discounts that person's life experience, because they've experienced life differently because of their color, Yeah. So it is, I get what Gary's saying as well. And that would be nice. But in the meantime, representation is very, very important. And the fact that there was representation in this film without it being initially a racial issue from George Romero is incredibly significant, considering the time in which this film was made.
I guess that's where I ultimately land, is like, oh, hey, here's a weird example in 1968 where there was a movie where nobody gave a shit.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
We're just like,
if only we had a world filled with George Romeros.
Right. They were like, hey, Dwayne's the best actor we got.
Yeah.
I mean, he literally says that. He says that in that interview with Guillermo del Toro. He's like, man, all it was is like, we knew a bunch of people and we were all at the same college. And we're like, Dwayne's the best actor. Like, I mean, that should be the dude. Yeah. It was like he came in an audition and we're like, why are we even talking about this? It's Dwayne. Dwayne's the guy. Play Ben.
So, but I think Jordan Peele is right about another thing, is that the ending of the film where Ben gets shot does not pack the same punch if it's a white dude. There's nothing necessarily in the film that indicates that, like, the cops, the posse that's hunting zombies are racist, but the subtext is sort of there, especially considering the era in which it was made, and which is something that is sadly still very relevant today. Ben's race also comes into play, I think, in the antagonism between him and Harry Cooper. Mm-hmm. The two, they immediately butt heads. They're immediately fighting over who's the leader. One of my favorite lines in the film was Ben putting him in his place, going, you go down to the cellar, you're the boss down there, but I'm the boss up here. And Harry Cooper, nothing in his dialogue is inherently like racist, but you can almost see this like seething rage below the surface, that right. Once again implies a racial issue. He feels that because he is older and whiter than Ben, that he should automatically be the leader, despite the fact that he is making much stupider decisions than Ben is.
Yeah. It's, yeah.
And in the end, everyone dies in the film. Everyone's either blown up or they're eaten, or in the case of Harry, shot by Ben, which again is not a heroic thing.
Or stabbed brutally by a garden spade.
True, yes. And then Ben is the lone survivor, and he hides out in the cellar only to emerge, hoping for rescue, and then he's shot by cops. Like, this is a guy who he's able to survive the undead, but he cannot survive white America at the end of the film, which is a hell of a fucking statement. And whether Romero intended that or not, it's a powerful image, and it is, I think, instrumental to the lasting legacy of this film.
Yeah. It's so crazy. I mean, I feel like we've been talking for forever, and you could literally do like a whole series about this film alone. There's a lot to say about Night of the Living Dead in so many ways. I mean, I guess in a lot of instances, an artist puts out a piece of art and you want people to attach their own meaning to the thing. I mean, God help us, there's so many ways you could read this film. You could talk about the idea that there's a failure of humanity to cooperate in the freaking house the whole time.
Humanity consuming itself,
Yeah, exactly. The fear of another, not just like the black race, but just in general, just like the fear of the other thing coming there, returning things to order, but at the cost of social justice. Like at the end, like it's just, there's like a whole freaking world of things you could gather out of this movie, and that's why it's retaining its legacy.
I agree. One of the things that Romero does in this film that I think is kind of along the lines of what you're talking about, as far as how many different takes you could have for this film, is one that I think is absolutely intentional on Romero's part. So there were two horror films released in 1968 that acted as a sort of transitional marker for the genre. The first was Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. It came out in June of that year. And the other one, of course, was Night of the Living Dead. And what both of these films did was it took the genre out of the castles, out of Transylvania, and it put it in the modern America. So in Rosemary's Baby, it's a little more blatant because the film is set mostly in an affluent apartment in New York City, in Manhattan. But Romero, what he does in Night of the Living Dead is he makes it almost like blatantly apparent that he's kind of trying to move horror into a new realm, because he starts the film in this gothic setting that would not be out of place in those old Universal horror movies. It starts it in a graveyard, starts it in a cemetery, and you've got lightning and rain, and it's very gothic, right? And then Barbara runs from the zombie, her brother gets killed, and he literally films the transition from a graveyard into a modern American house. And he's putting that transition on screen. Now, the big difference here, of course, is that Polanski, if you've seen Rosemary's Baby, he seems to he has a disdain for old horror movie tropes, whereas Romero grew up loving those movies. And he embraces the tropes of those movies, because the opening scenes of Night of the Living Dead, they feel like they're straight out of one of those 50s creature features.
Yeah, they do.
The staging, the acting, even the way that like Johnny and Barbara are dressed, they feel like they belong in the 50s more than in the late 60s.
He talks about in the interview I saw with him with Colin Geddes about seeing like Frankenstein and Dracula on prints where they like came around. I mean, he was he was young when those movies would have initially been circulated, but he talks about seeing them and how beautiful they were. But he went into a time period of the giant creature feature, like that sort of thing. And he was like, these things didn't have the same impact. He grew up sitting under his covers. He talks about, Todd, here's where you can appreciate it. He talks about reading comics like before the Code and
those old
the
EC,
horror, the EC comics, like reading horror movies. And he said that, like, despite what everybody thought or like what everybody acted like with like how disturbing these things were, he would giggle about it, because he said that you would read these things and there was like a moral code to these comics still, that like the guy being a dick would get his at the end, and somehow still it played itself out in a good way with like a moral tone. He called them like the Laurel comics. I can't remember. He said like Stephen King had a quote about a Laurel comic, like right before Pet Sematary, a Laurel comic is a moral comic or something like that. And I can't recall that exactly. But he talked about that being one of the things he enjoyed. So it's all the more reason, like you go into a movie like this and you hear him say like, I didn't mean to do shit. But you're like, dude, your whole life seems to have been built to do this shit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's crazy because but I think that transition into like modern horror is intentional on his part, because the film, like I said, it starts off as that like 50s like creature feature feel. It feels like Johnny and Barbara could be in one of those like giant bug movies or whatever. But as the film goes on, it gets grittier and grittier and darker and to something that was unlike anything that had really been seen on film before. And I think the gore, I think Gary mentioned the gore a little bit earlier being kind of shocking for the time, and it was a huge part of that. Now, gore had certainly been on film before. I think by this time, Herschel Gordon Lewis, also from Pittsburgh, had already made a name for himself as the godfather of gore, because I think Blood Feast was released in like 64 or so. He'd already made like Blood Feast and 2000 Maniacs and stuff like that. But those were sort of campy. You know, they were gory and in full color, blood red, but campy. Whereas Romero is... he's kind of combining that gore with a gritty documentary style realism that was like shock. That's what makes it so shocking to people, because it's less of a cartoon. Now it seems tame by today's standards, but in 1968, this freaked people out, man.
Yeah, it's definitely the starting point for a lot of the stuff that is shocking today, or you know, from then was shocking 10 years later, and then 10 years later got ramped up again, and so on and so forth. So this definitely falls into the category of must see for, I mean, it checks the must see because of so many reasons, you know.
If you're able to put yourself in the position of a person in 1968, or if you're able to just like transport yourself, like obviously I feel like that's part of it with films in general, is you have to put yourself in the position to enjoy the film for what it was able to present to you at the time it was created.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think historical context is essential for a lot of films.
Yeah, context. Always context.
Absolutely.
This movie presented to you a
With
lot
limited
of
interruption.
not only civil rights issues, but I mean, God, they threw in cannibalism. They threw in, matricide. The heroes die at the end. It's taboo busting at every freaking instance.
And then along the way, it creates an entire new subgenre, because, like we said, those original zombies were not like, they weren't flesh eaters. They were just, you know, walking corpses. Like, Romero introduced the idea that you could only kill them by destroying the brain, that they fed on flesh and things like that. And of course, some of those rules would be changed later on, especially by Dan O'Bannon's Return of the Living Dead. I think that established a lot of the more traditional zombie tropes, but it was built on what Romero did. But if you think about the fact that none of these tropes existed before this, that is an insane thing to think about.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to imagine. Honestly,
well, it is, and also just the fact that, like, I feel like I just like glazed over it for a second there, but I mean, I want to be very clear, like in all the discussions we've even had about black and white people and civil rights and that sort of thing. I mean, this movie incorporated the ability for a horror movie to make a statement, like an actual political statement, like a humanitarian statement, which is something that horror movies do on the regular now. Like, you almost
I mean,
Jordan Peele's whole career is built on this right now.
Absolutely,
it's like that this is a genre that can actually speak to something.
Like, sci-fi movies were kind of already doing it, but this seems to be a turning point for horror movies making a socio-political statement.
I feel like a lot of sci-fi, and maybe it's just the sci-fi that I'm into, ends up being in that cyberpunk subgenre where it's the oppressor is the government, and I guess to a degree this
goes along with that, but it seems like horror, and feel free to correct me or chime in with your own thoughts on this. Like, horror deals with the relationships between individuals and between people, whereas sci-fi takes more those big idea things, like the idea of governments and big corporations like controlling the people. Am I on?
No. You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
Todd.
yeah. I mean,
Actually,
I'm sure there are exceptions, but I think as a general rule, yeah, I think you're on the money.
Yeah, there's actual talks about this. I was
okay.
actually, like, there are papers written on this. I stumbled across a bunch when I would get into my like H.P. Lovecraft thing. Like, one of his things was incorporating sci-fi with horror, but like typically sci-fi is broader ideas. And that horror would like have more of an internal factor that anyway, not to drag that out, but basically, yeah, I mean, you can have these sci-fi ideas about like what humanity could be, or what the broader spectrum, like where we could be, or what could blah blah blah. Horror typically takes like something that is internally affecting people right now, like is dangerous and scary and sophisticated in a different way. Yeah, like horror usually attacks that. And that's what Romero is doing here, that these ideas are like, these are all internal dialogue, internal thoughts, like like things that people maybe aren't saying out loud that are like points. I mean, obviously some people are saying them out loud obnoxiously, but at this point, but yeah, I mean, it's real life things that are here and now that we're struggling with on screen, just depicted in a way that's more digestible to most people, I guess you'd say.
And what's crazy about that is that, Romero, for creating all these horror tropes and creating the way that horror movies are sort of utilized in making a statement, is that he never wanted to be a horror movie filmmaker. That was not his goal. He loved horror movies as a kid, but that was not his career aspiration. Like, remember the Latent Image crew, they really only settled on doing a horror movie because they thought they could make a quick buck. It was cheap. They could sell it, easy to do. Then they would make back their investment, make a little bit of money, and then maybe get a little bit of recognition to make their next movie. But they didn't count on Night of the Living Dead being the phenomenon that it would become. So the next film that Romero directed was a drama. It's a love story called There's Always Vanilla. A lot of the same crew members as the Latent Image that worked on Night worked on this movie. But it was less congenial. Like, they started fighting a little bit more, and tensions ran pretty high. It was, by all accounts, not a very good shoot. And it didn't help that the film, when it was released, was not particularly successful, either with critics or with box office. It's even, Romero calls it his least favorite of every movie he ever made.
Wow.
Romero's next film, Season of the Witch, which I actually watched yesterday. I'd never seen it before, so I found it on Amazon Prime and watched it. It delves a little closer to the horror genre, although it could barely be considered a horror film, although it's got some horror elements. It's got witchcraft involved in it.
I've been interested, since we're in this process of like trying to watch that. Like,
it's very easy to find. It's on Arrow Videos thing, their streaming service on Amazon Prime. It's very easy to find out there. And there are some nightmare sequences in it that are really cool and would kind of hint at some of the stuff that Romero would do later on. But it didn't do well either. It was another strikeout for him. So then he turned back to kind of straight up horror with The Crazies, which is if you've never seen it, it's a very Night of the Living Dead-esque tale of a town overrun by toxic citizens. And we might tackle The Crazies later on. I feel like doing a series on like pandemic movies might be pretty fitting. And The Crazies could work for that. But after working on The Crazies, which The Crazies did okay, it's been embraced more later on, but he decided to take a bit of a breather. He worked in television for about 3 years after that. And it was during the time he was working on television that he met a guy named Richard Rubinstein. They worked on some projects together. And then they had decided they'd make a film together. And it was that film that would end up being the film that Romero would call his favorite of his career. He said that all the way up until his death, that this movie that they made was the favorite of his career. And it's also a film that first paired him officially with a young makeup effects prodigy by the name of Tom Savini. So what we're going to do here on the show, this is where we're going to pick up next week. It's a movie called Martin, released in 1970, like 76 or so. I didn't write that down. Sorry. But that's what we're going to talk about next week for part 2 of this series. So what we're planning to do is we're going to spend the next several weeks not only examining the career of Romero, but very specifically focusing on the films that he made with his frequent collaborator, Tom Savini. These are two giants of the genre that worked together for most of their career.
77, by the way.
77, okay. So we're going to focus on their collaborations over the next, I think it's like 8 or 10 weeks. There's a lot of films that they did together. So it's going to be a fun journey. It's going to be a fun kind of seeing how their careers weave together. I think it's going to be really cool. So join us next week, of course, for Martin. You can find that online streaming. I think, actually, I don't think Martin is streaming, but it's out there.
I mean, can we just tell people to look on YouTube?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in the case
at this point, can we just say look on YouTube? It's
this one is it's not streaming that we could find. The DVD is long out of print, but it is. Yeah, if you search for it, you can find it. We will typically post on our website. You'll find a link in the show description, places where you can watch pretty much all the movies that we talk about every week. So because again, we do want you to watch along with us. But this one, we couldn't skip it, even though it was hard to find, because it is the first collaboration between Romero and Savini.
I feel like we're doing ourselves a disservice here. I know we're going long, but I mean, first of all, this is a classic piece of cinema that deserves all the time we can afford it. And two, this is our first episode with Cinema Shock. Why would it's okay that it's long. We've got to talk about zombies for a second. This movie
We can talk about zombies for 2 hours, Gary.
Yeah, but did we talk about zombies through history? What people think zombies are? Because I was watching this movie and I remember all the discussions of like 28 Days Later and like everywhere that zombies came along. And this is the OG, right? Like this is the one that people consider the OG. And it's like these zombies, first of all, the first one that you see in the movie looks like it's trying to run. It's struggling. It's trying to run. Though.
He also uses
uses a fucking brick. Mm-hmm. So do not tell me the zombies cannot run or use tools, because this one definitely features that.
Yeah,
zombies are not above that. I just wanted to establish that. Like,
thank you, Gary.
This is. I feel like this is important for the zombie conversation at large.
Well, we are going to have multiple conversations about zombies over the next few weeks. So
I feel like right now we need the graphic of the star from NBC that the more you know, just dun, 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 dun.
Well, I'm just saying, stop watching 28 Days Later or like whatever movie you're watching.
They're not even zombies.
Like run. Oh, that's a good point.
They're
stop watching the
infected.
Movie Zombies Run, Train to Busan, or whatever.
Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead.
Or Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. You'll be like, oh, I like my zombies walking.
No, okay, zombies don't exist anyway. Who gives a shit?
Yeah. You're being really bitchy about something that, like Romero in the OG, there are lots of possibilities available to you.
Well, we're going to talk a lot more about that in the coming weeks. Thank you guys for discussing this with us. I know this is a long episode, but again, there's a shit ton to talk about with this movie, and we could probably talk for another 2 hours if we wanted to, because there's so much to dive into on this movie.
Let's talk about Romero's apartment.
Oh, shut the fuck up. We're ending this podcast. Please follow us on social media and all that. You'll find links to all of that in the show notes on this, wherever you're listening to this podcast. We'll have links to everything. We'll have links to our personal Twitters and letterboxes and all that stuff. So you can find that everywhere. Follow us. Give us a review on Apple Podcasts if that's where you listen. Share us with your friends, all that stuff.
Yeah, if you haven't hit subscribe already on the YouTube, you're seeing this on YouTube, please go ahead and hit subscribe. Yeah, and like Justin said, the 5-star review on the podcast. I know it seems like a lot, but you can take like 5 seconds out of your day. Instead of scrolling through your Twitter feed, go give us a 5-star review on Apple. Sign up for YouTube if you haven't already. If you have a Google account, which you do, go into YouTube and hit subscribe. It helps us out. It helps it gets us in front of more people. That's what we need here. And if you like what we do, and believe me, all of us are not drunk bastards like me. Some of them are Justin, who put in a lot of time and research into this situation, and they deserve your support. Justin has a very nice voice on film. I love hearing him talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Todd, for joining us for this one.
My pleasure, as always.
Well, where can you guys want to go ahead and give your personal handles?
Sure.
Todd?
I'm at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
I am at
_Bishop.
Sorry. Sorry.
You go ahead. We'll edit that.
Just call my
We'll do that.
In the mirror, if you say my name 5 times, I will just show up and give you my Twitter. Which is? I am at This Is Gary Horne.
I'm at Justin _Bishop. Until next week. Yeah, just do it.
Yeah. Feels the same, right? We'll keep this.
Yeah, I think
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
And be excellent to each other.
Johnny has the keys.
Out of all the quotes.
Interesting choice, Todd.
I feel it really applies to many different things. So yeah.
In life,
I'm gonna stick with it.
Right.
If I'm regular on the show now, I'm sticking with that as my
every week. Johnny has the keys, is what you're gonna say.
Yep, Johnny has the keys.
All right, we might have to have a meeting about that.
Should let's use an actual more memorable quote. That is nobody's favorite quote from Night of the Living Dead is Johnny has the keys.
Johnny has the keys.
All right, we'll see you next week with Martin. Martin, you so.
I'm glad we got that joke out of the way. I'm glad we got that joke.
Gina.